The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Frogmore Cottage as Prince Harry sat in his study, staring at the stack of documents that would change everything. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the top folder, marked with the royal seal and stamped confidential. Inside were conversations, emails, and meeting notes that painted a picture so devastating, so carefully orchestrated, that even he struggled to believe what he was reading. Meghan entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She had learned to read her husband's moods over the years, and, tonight, his shoulders carried the weight of something far heavier than their usual struggles with the press or palace protocol. Setting down the cups, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What is it, Harry?" she asked softly, noticing how his jaw tightened as he continued reading. Harry looked up at his wife, his eyes reflecting a mixture of hurt and determination that she had rarely seen. "They planned it all, Meg. Every single leak, every negative story, every moment that made us feel like we were going crazy, it was all coordinated." The documents before him told a story that began years earlier, long before Meghan had even entered his life. It was a systematic plan, crafted by senior courtiers and certain family members, designed to manage what they saw as the Harry problem. The spare heir had always been too independent, too willing to speak his mind, too passionate about causes that made the establishment uncomfortable. Harry remembered the first signs, moments he had dismissed as coincidences or misunderstandings. There was the charity event where he had spoken passionately about mental health, only to find his comments twisted in the next day's papers to suggest he was unstable. There was the time he had tried to modernize one of his patronages, only to be told by palace staff that tradition must be maintained, while simultaneously watching those same staff brief journalists about his reckless ideas. But the real campaign had begun when Meghan arrived. Harry read through email chains between press secretaries and senior courtiers, planning how to manage the narrative around their relationship. There were discussions about limiting Meghan's public appearances, controlling her wardrobe choices, and ensuring that any positive coverage of the couple didn't overshadow other family members. One particular email made Harry's blood run cold. It was from a senior aide to his father's office, dated just weeks after his wedding. The subject line read, "Operation Clean Slate, Phase 2. The contents outlined a systematic plan to undermine Harry and Meghan's popularity through strategic briefings to preferred journalists, emphasizing Meghan's American background and highlighting any perceived protocol breaches. "They called it a stitch-up," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's literally what they called it. A way to stitch up the narrative so tightly that we'd have no choice but to fall in line or leave." Meghan sat down beside him, her own hands shaking as she read over his shoulder. She saw her own name mentioned repeatedly, described in terms that made her stomach turn. There were discussions about her Hollywood background being a liability, debates about whether her mixed-race heritage would complicate the family's image in certain Commonwealth countries, and cold calculations about how her relationship with her father could be exploited for maximum embarrassment. But what hurt Harry most were the family members involved. He saw his stepmother's private secretary's name appearing frequently in the communications, coordinating stories that would elevate her image while diminishing his and Meghan's. There were messages from his brother's office, providing details about private family conversations that later appeared in newspaper columns. Most painful of all were the indirect references to his father's knowledge and approval of the campaign. Harry stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the grounds of Frogmore were shrouded in darkness, the same darkness that had shrouded the truth for so long. He thought about all the times he had questioned his own sanity, wondering if he was being paranoid or oversensitive. The documents proved that his instincts had been correct. There had been a deliberate campaign against him and his wife. The plan had been sophisticated and multi-layered. Positive stories about Harry and Meghan were killed or buried on inside pages, while negative stories were prominently featured and followed up with opinion pieces from royal experts who seemed to have insider knowledge. The timing was always perfect. Whenever the couple had a successful engagement or received positive coverage, a damaging story would appear within days to eclipse it. Harry read about the careful cultivation of certain journalists, who were given exclusive access to other family members in exchange for critical coverage of him and Meghan. He saw how palace sources provided detailed information about their private conversations, their relationship struggles, even their security arrangements. The violation felt complete and devastating. One section of the documents detailed how the palace had deliberately failed to protect Meghan from racist coverage in the tabloids, with senior staff arguing that correcting false stories would only draw more attention to the issues. Harry read transcripts of meetings where courtiers discussed whether Meghan's mental health struggles were a weakness that could be exploited or a liability that needed to be managed. The revelation about Archie's birth announcement was particularly painful. Harry discovered that the palace had deliberately delayed and minimized the announcement of his son's arrival, ensuring that it received less prominent coverage than other royal births. There were discussions about limiting photo opportunities and preventing Meghan from participating in traditional post-birth appearances, all designed to reduce the couple's public profile. As Harry continued reading, he found evidence of financial manipulation as well. Budgets for their charitable work had been quietly reduced, staff members had been reassigned without explanation, and requests for resources had been ignored or denied. The goal was clear: to make their royal duties as difficult and frustrating as possible, forcing them to either accept a diminished role or leave entirely. Meghan watched her husband process each revelation, seeing the pain and anger building in his expression. She knew that this moment would define their future. They could either accept this betrayal in silence or take action that would irrevocably change their relationship with his family. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Harry turned from the window, his decision already made. "I'm going to expose every single detail. The public deserves to know the truth, and I'm done protecting people who never protected us." The decision wasn't made lightly. Harry understood the consequences of revealing the documents. It would effectively end his relationship with his father and brother, potentially damage the monarchy's reputation, and certainly result in his complete exile from royal life. But the alternative, continuing to live with the knowledge of how systematically they had been betrayed, was no longer acceptable. Harry began planning his response immediately. He contacted trusted journalists who had always reported fairly on their story, began organizing the documents chronologically, and started drafting his own account of how the campaign had affected their mental health and their marriage. He knew that timing would be crucial. The revelation needed to be comprehensive and undeniable. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very system designed to silence him had provided him with the evidence needed to expose its machinations. Palace staff had been so confident in their control, so assured of their invincibility, that they had documented their efforts in detail. Now those same documents would become their undoing. As the night wore on, Harry and Meghan worked together to organize the evidence. They categorized the documents by theme: media manipulation, family betrayal, financial constraints, security concerns, and personal attacks. Each category painted a picture of systematic abuse designed to break their spirits and force their compliance. The personal attacks were the most difficult to review. Harry read about deliberate attempts to isolate Meghan from potential friends and allies within the royal circle. There were instructions to staff about limiting her access to certain events, briefings about how to make her feel unwelcome at family gatherings, and strategies for ensuring that any mistakes she made were magnified and publicized. One particularly devastating document outlined a plan to exploit Meghan's relationship with her father. Palace staff had identified Thomas Markle as a potential pressure point and had discussed ways to exacerbate the family rift for maximum media impact. They had known about the paparazzi photos before the wedding and had chosen not to intervene, calculating that the resulting drama would overshadow the positive coverage of the ceremony. Harry also discovered that his own mental health struggles had been weaponized against him. Comments he had made privately about dealing with grief and trauma had been shared with journalists and presented as evidence of instability. His work with military veterans and his advocacy for mental health awareness had been quietly undermined by briefings suggesting he was emotionally volatile and unreliable. The documents revealed a level of institutional cruelty that shocked even Harry, who had grown up understanding the palace's capacity for coldness. This wasn't just about protecting the monarchy or managing difficult family dynamics, it was about deliberately destroying two people who had dared to challenge the established order. As dawn approached, Harry made a series of phone calls. He contacted his legal team to ensure that releasing the documents wouldn't violate any laws or confidentiality agreements. He reached out to documentary filmmakers who had previously expressed interest in telling their story. Most importantly, he called his grandmother's former private secretary, one of the few palace insiders who had always treated him with genuine respect and kindness. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Harry explained what he had discovered and what he planned to do about it. The elderly courtier listened in shocked silence as Harry described the extent of the campaign against him and Meghan. Finally, the man spoke, his voice heavy with sadness. "I suspected something like this might be happening, Your Royal Highness, but I never imagined it was so comprehensive. Your grandmother would be heartbroken to know how far things have gone." Harry felt a moment of doubt. His grandmother had always been his anchor, the one family member whose love and support had never wavered. Would exposing this betrayal somehow dishonor her memory? But then, he remembered how she had always valued truth and duty above personal comfort, and he knew she would want him to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. By morning, Harry had made his decision final and irrevocable. He would release the documents in phases, allowing each revelation to have maximum impact while building toward the complete picture of institutional betrayal. The first release would focus on the media manipulation, establishing the existence of a coordinated campaign against him and Meghan. As Meghan prepared breakfast for their family, Harry sat in his study, looking one more time at the documents that would change everything. He thought about the little boy he had been, walking behind his mother's coffin while the institution that was supposed to protect him planned how to control his future. He thought about the young man who had believed in duty and service, only to discover that loyalty was a one-way street. Most of all, he thought about his children and the world he wanted them to inherit. Archie and Lilibet deserved to know the truth about their family's history, even if that truth was painful and complicated. They deserved to grow up in a world where institutional bullying and systematic cruelty were exposed and challenged, not hidden and perpetuated. Harry's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his publisher, confirming that legal teams had cleared the way for publication. The world was about to learn the truth about the royal family's carefully constructed image, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first leak hit the British press like a seismic shock at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Harry had chosen the timing carefully, early enough to dominate the day's news cycle, but late enough for international media to pick up the story for their evening broadcasts. The headline in The Guardian read, "Secret Palace Documents Reveal Coordinated Campaign Against Prince Harry and Meghan." Within minutes, Harry's phone was buzzing with calls from Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington Palace. He let them all go to voicemail. He had anticipated this reaction and had prepared himself mentally for the fury that would follow. What he hadn't anticipated was how liberating it would feel to finally have the truth in the open. The initial release contained just 5 documents, but they were carefully chosen for maximum impact. There was the email chain about Operation Clean Slate, the meeting notes discussing Meghan's problematic American background, and the communications between press secretaries and journalists about timing negative stories. Each document was authenticated by digital forensics experts and accompanied by detailed explanations of the context and participants involved. Meghan was in their kitchen in Montecito, making breakfast for Archie, when she heard Harry's sharp intake of breath from his office. She knew immediately that the response had begun. Walking into the room, she found him staring at his laptop screen, where dozens of news websites were already running the story. "It's everywhere," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. "BBC, CNN, ABC News, The Times, The Telegraph, everyone's picked it up." The palace's initial response was swift but predictably inadequate. A terse statement from Buckingham Palace declared that they do not comment on private internal communications and that discussions about the Duke and Duchess of Sussex remain confidential family matters. But the damage was already done. The public now had concrete evidence of what many had suspected, that the negative coverage of Harry and Meghan hadn't been organic, but carefully orchestrated. Harry's phone finally stopped ringing around noon, when he made the decision to turn it off completely. He knew that palace officials would be demanding explanations, threatening legal action, and trying to negotiate some form of damage control. But he had moved beyond the point where such conversations would be productive. The truth was now public, and there was no going back. The reaction on social media was immediate and intense. Supporters of Harry and Meghan shared the articles with comments of vindication and outrage. Critics accused the couple of betraying the royal family and damaging the monarchy for personal gain. But what surprised Harry most was the response from people who had previously been neutral or even skeptical of their claims. Many expressed shock at the level of institutional manipulation revealed in the documents. Royal correspondent Victoria Arbiter tweeted, "If these documents are authentic, they reveal a level of calculated cruelty that goes far beyond normal palace politics. This is about the systematic destruction of two people's reputations and mental health." By evening, palace sources were briefing journalists that the documents were taken out of context and that the communications were routine internal discussions rather than evidence of any coordinated campaign. But Harry had anticipated this response. He had spent weeks preparing additional evidence that would contradict any claims of misinterpretation or routine procedure. The second release came 3 days later, and it was devastating. This batch of documents included detailed timelines showing how positive stories about Harry and Meghan were consistently overshadowed by negative coverage within hours or days. There were communications between palace staff and newspaper editors discussing which photographers would be given access to events and which would be excluded based on their likelihood to capture flattering or unflattering images. Most damaging were the transcripts of recorded phone conversations between senior courtiers and journalists, where the courtiers explicitly outlined their strategy for undermining public support for the Sussexes. In one particularly revealing conversation, a senior aide to Prince Charles spoke candidly about the need to reduce Harry's profile before his popularity surpassed that of other family members. "The boy's too much like his mother," the aide had said during a call that was apparently recorded for internal records. "All emotion and causes. The public loves it now, but it's not sustainable for the institution. Better to cut him down to size before he becomes a real problem." The reference to Diana sent shockwaves through the media and public. Comparisons between Harry's treatment and his mother's experiences with the palace had been made before, but now there was concrete evidence that courtiers had explicitly viewed his popularity as threatening and had taken deliberate action to diminish it. Harry watched the coverage from his home in California, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing the truth finally exposed, but also profound sadness at the confirmation of what he had long suspected, that the institution he had served faithfully for decades had viewed him as an enemy to be neutralized rather than a family member to be protected. Meghan found him that evening sitting in their garden, staring at the sunset over the Pacific. She had been monitoring the British press coverage throughout the day and had seen how vicious the commentary had become. Some columnists were calling for Harry to be stripped of his titles, while others were demanding police investigations into how he had obtained the documents. "Do you regret it?" she asked, settling beside him on the bench they had installed when they first moved to the house. Harry considered the question seriously. The revelations had indeed caused enormous damage to his family relationships. His father hadn't spoken to him since the first documents were released, and William had issued a public statement distancing himself from Harry's actions. But, looking at his wife and thinking about their children playing inside the house, Harry knew his answer. "No," he said firmly. "They spent years trying to make us feel crazy, making us doubt our own perceptions and experiences. Now everyone can see that we were right all along. Whatever happens next, our children will grow up knowing that we stood up for ourselves and for the truth." The third release, which came a week later, focused specifically on the treatment of Meghan and the racial dimensions of the campaign against her. These documents were the most difficult for Harry to review and the most dangerous to release, but he knew they were also the most important. The files revealed explicit discussions about Meghan's mixed-race heritage and how it could be used to create controversy. There were communications with editors of tabloid newspapers, discussing which aspects of Meghan's family background to emphasize and which to downplay. Most shocking were the recorded conversations where senior staff referred to Meghan using language that was barely coded racism. One particularly disturbing document was a risk assessment prepared before Harry and Meghan's engagement was announced. The assessment listed Meghan's American Hollywood background and mixed-race heritage as potential reputational risks for the monarchy. It recommended limiting her public appearances until she could be properly prepared for royal duties, with specific suggestions for how to present her in ways that would be acceptable to traditional audiences. The document also revealed that palace staff had conducted extensive research into Meghan's family history, looking specifically for problematic relatives or past incidents that could be used to embarrass her if she ever became difficult to manage. The level of surveillance and investigation into a woman who was simply dating a royal family member was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. International media coverage of this release was particularly intense, with American outlets expressing outrage at the treatment of an American citizen by the British establishment. The story dominated news cycles in Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth countries, many of which were already grappling with questions about their relationship with the monarchy in an increasingly diverse world. Civil rights organizations in the United States issued statements condemning the palace's treatment of Meghan and calling for investigations into institutional racism within the royal household. The NAACP released a statement saying, "These documents reveal a level of systematic racial targeting that would be illegal in any American workplace." The British monarchy's treatment of the Duchess of Sussex represents exactly the kind of institutional racism that modern societies must reject. Back in Britain, the reaction was more divided but no less intense. Progressive politicians called for parliamentary investigations into the palace's conduct, while conservative voices accused Harry of damaging British institutions for personal revenge. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a rare public statement expressing concern about the evident pain and division within the royal family and calling for reconciliation based on truth and understanding. But it was the response from ordinary people that affected Harry most deeply. Letters and messages poured in from individuals who had experienced workplace bullying, racial discrimination, and institutional gaslighting. Many thanked him for giving them language to describe their own experiences and courage to speak out against systems that had silenced them. One letter, from a young mixed-race woman working in the British civil service, particularly moved Harry. "Your wife's experience helped me understand what was happening to me at work. I thought I was imagining things when my colleagues excluded me from meetings or when my ideas were consistently credited to others. Seeing how the palace treated her, I realized that the problem wasn't in my head, it was in the system. I've now filed a formal complaint and found others who had similar experiences." Harry shared the letter with Meghan, who read it with tears in her eyes. Despite the personal cost of the revelations, they were beginning to see how their story might help others who had faced similar treatment. The palace's response to the third release was markedly different from their previous statements. Instead of denying the authenticity of the documents or claiming they were taken out of context, they announced that an independent review would be conducted into workplace practices and diversity procedures within the royal household. The statement acknowledged that the documents raised serious concerns that needed to be addressed. But Harry wasn't satisfied with promises of internal reviews and gradual reform. He had one more batch of documents to release, and these would be the most personally devastating of all. They revealed the direct involvement of family members in the campaign against him and Meghan, including his father and brother. The communications showed that both Prince Charles and Prince William had been regular recipients of briefings about the anti-Sussex strategy and had, in several cases, suggested specific angles for negative coverage. There were messages from William's private secretary discussing how to ensure that positive coverage of Harry and Meghan's charitable work didn't overshadow William and Catherine's activities. Most painful for Harry was a recorded conversation between his father and a senior aide, where Charles expressed frustration with Harry's emotional outbursts about media coverage and suggested that perhaps a period of reduced visibility would help Harry gain proper perspective on his role within the family. "The boy needs to understand that duty means accepting one's place," Charles had said during the conversation. "His mother never learned that lesson, and look how that ended. Better to teach him now before he does irreparable damage to himself and the institution." The comparison to Diana's fate sent chills through Harry as he listened to the recording. The callousness of using his mother's death as a cautionary tale about the consequences of challenging the system revealed a level of emotional manipulation that he had never fully grasped before. As Harry prepared for the final release of documents, he knew that this would be the point of no return. Once the public learned about his family's direct involvement in the campaign against him, any possibility of reconciliation would be destroyed forever. But he also knew that maintaining his silence would mean accepting a relationship built on lies and manipulation. The decision had been made the moment he discovered the first document. truth, no matter how painful, was preferable to a peace built on systematic deception and institutional cruelty. The final release came on a Friday afternoon, deliberately timed to dominate the weekend news cycle when families across Britain would be discussing the revelations over dinner tables. Harry had titled this batch Family Matters, The Personal Betrayal, and it contained the most damaging evidence yet, direct communications from his father and brother that proved their active participation in the campaign against him and Meghan. The lead document was a WhatsApp exchange between Prince William and his private secretary, dated just days after Harry and Meghan's explosive Oprah interview. In the messages, William expressed frustration with his brother's treachery and asked for help in crafting a public response that would put Harry in his place without making us look petty. The private secretary had responded with suggestions for how to use reliable journalists to plant stories questioning Harry's mental state and suggesting that Meghan had manipulated him into betraying his family. The messages revealed a calculated strategy to portray Harry as an unreliable narrator while positioning William as the responsible brother who was trying to protect the monarchy from damage. But it was the communications involving Prince Charles that cut deepest. Harry had included a series of emails between his father's office and senior palace staff, discussing what they termed the Harry problem and various strategies for bringing him to heel. The emails revealed that Charles had been fully briefed on every aspect of the campaign against his son and had approved strategies for limiting Harry's public profile. One particularly devastating email from Charles's private secretary outlined a plan to gradually reduce Harry's military patronages and ceremonial duties, creating the impression that he was being sidelined due to his own incompetence rather than deliberate institutional action. The email noted that this approach would allow the palace to maintain plausible deniability while achieving their goal of diminishing Harry's influence. Most shocking was a recorded phone call between Charles and a newspaper editor, where Harry's father had personally provided details about private family conversations that later appeared in print as damaging stories about Harry's erratic behavior and concerning mental state. The recording captured Charles describing his son's therapy sessions and private discussions about grief, information that was subsequently used to paint Harry as unstable and unreliable. The public reaction to these revelations was immediate and intense. The image of Prince Charles, the future king, actively conspiring against his own son shocked even those who had been critical of Harry's previous disclosures. Social media exploded with commentary ranging from outrage to heartbreak, with many people expressing that the revelations had fundamentally changed their view of the royal family. Within hours of the release, protests began forming outside Buckingham Palace. Demonstrators carried signs reading "No More Royal Racism" and "Protect Harry and Meghan." Counter-protesters also appeared, defending the monarchy and accusing Harry of destroying his family for money and attention. The competing crowds created a tense atmosphere that required significant police presence to manage. Harry watched the coverage from his home office, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with relief. Meghan sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder as they observed the chaos unfolding across the Atlantic. Their children were playing in the next room, blissfully unaware that their father had just irrevocably altered the course of their family's history. "The children will ask questions someday," Meghan said quietly, voicing what they were both thinking. Harry nodded, his expression resolute despite the obvious pain in his eyes. "And we'll have answers for them. Real answers, not the carefully crafted lies that were told to me growing up." The palace's response to this final release was swift and unprecedented. Within 3 hours, Buckingham Palace issued a statement announcing that an emergency meeting of senior royals had been convened and that significant decisions regarding the future of the monarchy would be made in the coming days. The statement also announced the immediate suspension of several senior staff members pending a full investigation into the allegations. But, for the first time since Harry began releasing the documents, there was also a personal response from his family. Prince William issued a statement through Kensington Palace that was notably different in tone from previous palace communications. Instead of denying or deflecting, William acknowledged that serious mistakes had been made and that he deeply regretted actions that had caused pain to his brother and sister-in-law. "The revelations of the past weeks have forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about how our family and institution have operated," William's statement read. "While I cannot undo the harm that has been caused, I commit to working toward understanding and, hopefully, eventual healing." Charles's response was more complex and defensive. His office released a lengthy statement that acknowledged institutional failures while attempting to contextualize his actions as efforts to protect the monarchy during a period of significant change. The statement expressed profound regret for the pain caused to Harry and Meghan while maintaining that many of the decisions had been made with the best interests of the family and institution in mind. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Queen Camilla, who had been notably absent from public view since the first documents were released, issued her own personal statement that surprised everyone, including Harry himself. As someone who has experienced the particular cruelty of British tabloids and palace briefings, Camilla's statement began, "I cannot remain silent about what has been revealed regarding the treatment of Harry and Meghan. While I was not involved in the specific campaigns detailed in these documents, I recognize the systematic nature of the abuse they describe, and I am profoundly sorry for my failure to speak out against it when I witnessed it occurring." Camilla's statement went on to acknowledge that her own integration into the royal family had been made possible partly by the palace's success in rehabilitating her image through the same types of media manipulation that had been used against Harry and Meghan. She called for fundamental reform of how the royal household interacted with the press and treated family members who challenged conventional expectations. The statement from his stepmother moved Harry unexpectedly. Of all his family members, Camilla was perhaps the one he had least expected to acknowledge the truth of his experiences. Her recognition of the systematic nature of the abuse, and her admission of her own passive complicity, felt like the first genuine acknowledgement from within his family of what he and Meghan had endured. International reaction to the final revelations was even more intense than previous responses. The President of the United States issued a rare statement on British internal affairs, expressing concern about the treatment of an American citizen and calling for accountability. The Canadian Prime Minister announced that his government would be reviewing the country's relationship with the monarchy in light of the revelations. Most significantly, several Commonwealth countries began formal discussions about their constitutional arrangements with the British Crown. Jamaica's Prime Minister announced that the revelations had accelerated our timeline for becoming a republic, while officials in Australia called for immediate parliamentary debates about the monarchy's future role. The economic impact was also substantial. Tourism to royal sites dropped significantly as international visitors expressed discomfort with supporting an institution that had been revealed to engage in systematic racism and family abuse. Major brands began quietly withdrawing from events associated with the royal family, concerned about potential damage to their own reputations. But perhaps the most profound impact was on ordinary families across Britain and the Commonwealth. The revelations had sparked countless conversations about institutional power, family dynamics, and the ways that systematic abuse could be normalized and hidden. Mental health organizations reported increased calls from people who recognized their own experiences in Harry and Meghan's story. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist specializing in institutional trauma, observed, "What Prince Harry has revealed goes far beyond royal family drama. These documents show how powerful institutions can systematically gaslight and abuse individuals while maintaining public credibility. Many people are recognizing similar patterns in their own workplaces, families, and communities." The documents also had unexpected legal implications. Several law firms announced that they were reviewing the materials for potential criminal charges related to harassment, conspiracy, and violations of privacy laws. While the royal family's traditional immunity from prosecution complicated such efforts, legal experts argued that staff members and journalists involved in the campaign could potentially face charges. Harry had not anticipated these broader implications when he first decided to release the documents. His primary goal had been to clear his and Meghan's names and expose the truth about their treatment. But, as he watched the global reaction unfold, he began to understand that his revelations had become something much larger, a catalyst for examining how power operates in modern societies and how institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals. The personal cost, however, remained enormous. Harry's relationship with his father appeared to be permanently severed, despite Charles's public expressions of regret. Communication between the brothers had ceased entirely after William's initial statement, and there were reports that other family members had been forbidden from having any contact with Harry or Meghan. Most painfully, the revelations had complicated Harry's relationship with his own memories of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. While she had not been directly involved in the campaign against him, several documents revealed that senior staff had briefed her regularly on their activities and that she had raised no objections to their strategies. The image of the loving grandmother who had always supported him was now clouded by evidence of her institutional loyalty taking precedence over family protection. Sitting in his garden as another California sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Harry reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared little boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin had grown into a man willing to sacrifice everything to expose the truth about the institution that had shaped and, ultimately, betrayed him. Megan joined him outside, carrying their daughter while Archie ran ahead to play on the swing set Harry had installed when they first moved to Montecito. Watching his children play freely, without the weight of royal protocol or institutional expectations, Harry felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. "Do you think it was worth it?" Megan asked, echoing her question from weeks earlier but with a different tone. Now she wasn't asking whether he regretted his decision, but whether the cost had been justified by the outcome. Harry watched Archie push Lilibet gently on the baby swing, both children laughing with pure joy. Around the world, conversations were taking place about power, accountability, and truth because of the documents he had released. Families were having honest discussions about racism and institutional abuse. People who had been gaslit and manipulated by powerful institutions were finding their voices. "Yes," he said simply. "It was worth it." They're growing up in a world where the truth matters more than protecting powerful people who abuse their positions. That's worth any personal cost. As night fell over California, the global impact of Harry's revelations continued to unfold. The story was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a reckoning with institutional power that would reshape not just the monarchy, but the broader conversation about accountability in the modern world. 6 months after the final documents were released, the world had fundamentally changed. The revelations had triggered what historians would later call the Great Reckoning, a global examination of institutional power and accountability that extended far beyond the British monarchy. Harry sat in his study, reviewing the pages of a book he was writing about institutional trauma and recovery, when his assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, there's a call from London," she said hesitantly. "It's from Buckingham Palace." Harry had received no direct communication from his family since the revelations began, despite numerous attempts by intermediaries to arrange conversations. He had assumed that any future contact would come through lawyers or official channels, not as a personal phone call. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to take the call. The voice on the other end was his father's private secretary, speaking in the formal tone reserved for the most serious royal business. "Your Royal Highness, His Majesty has asked me to inform you that he would like to speak with you personally. He wanted me to emphasize that this is a conversation between a father and son, not an institutional communication." Harry felt his heart rate increase. Despite everything that had happened, despite the evidence of his father's involvement in the campaign against him, a part of him still longed for reconciliation. But he had learned to be cautious about hope where his family was concerned. "I'll need to discuss this with my wife," Harry replied. "And any conversation would need to be recorded for our protection. Too much has been said and denied over the years." The private secretary paused, clearly not expecting this condition. "I'll relay your response to His Majesty and get back to you." Meghan found Harry in the garden an hour later, staring at the ocean with the same distant expression she had learned to recognize during their most difficult moments. When he told her about the call, her reaction was immediate and protective. "Harry, you know this could be another manipulation. After everything they've done, after all the evidence of how they operate, you can't trust that this is genuine." Harry nodded, understanding her concern. The documents he had released had revealed a pattern of behavior spanning decades. His family and the institution around them had consistently chosen loyalty to the crown over protection of individual family members. But something in his father's request felt different. "Maybe," he said slowly. "But I think I need to find out. If there's any chance for real accountability, for genuine change, I have to take it. And if it's just another manipulation, at least I'll know for certain." The conversation with Charles took place 3 days later, via secure video link. Harry had insisted on having his lawyer present, while Charles had chosen to speak without any palace staff in the room. The visual of his father, looking older and more frail than Harry remembered, sitting alone in his study at Clarence House, was unexpectedly moving. "Harry," Charles began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I wanted to speak with you directly because I've spent months reviewing those documents, and I've come to understand that I failed you in ways that I'm only beginning to comprehend." The admission was more direct than anything Harry had expected. Throughout his life, conversations with his father had been characterized by oblique references and institutional language. This level of personal acknowledgement was unprecedented. Charles continued, "I want you to know that I've spent considerable time with therapists and advisors trying to understand how I could have allowed such systematic cruelty to be carried out against you and Meghan. The answer is uncomfortable but necessary. I prioritized the institution over my children, and I justified terrible actions by telling myself they were necessary for the greater good." Harry listened carefully, analyzing every word for signs of manipulation or calculated messaging. But what he heard in his father's voice was genuine anguish and what appeared to be authentic self-reflection. "I know that apologies are insufficient," Charles went on. "Words cannot undo the damage that was done to you, to Meghan, and to my grandchildren. But I want you to know that significant changes have been made to how we operate. The staff members who orchestrated the campaign against you have been dismissed. We've implemented new policies regarding media relations and family communications. Most importantly, we've established an independent oversight board to prevent this kind of systematic abuse from happening again." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering topics that had never been discussed honestly between them. Charles acknowledged the racial dimensions of Meghan's treatment, admitting that the palace had shamefully failed to protect her from obvious discrimination. He expressed regret about his own role in sharing private family information with the media, recognizing that this had been a profound violation of trust. Most significantly, Charles offered something that Harry had never received from his family: a full acknowledgement of the validity of his experiences and perceptions. "For years, we made you feel like you were imagining things, like you were being oversensitive or paranoid," Charles said. "The documents you released prove that your instincts were correct all along. We gaslit you systematically, and I am profoundly sorry for that psychological abuse." When the call ended, Harry sat in silence for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. Meghan entered the room cautiously, searching his face for signs of how the conversation had affected him. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. Harry considered the question carefully. "Complicated," he said finally. "I believe he was genuine. I think he's actually done the work to understand what happened and why it was wrong. But I also don't know if that changes anything practical about our relationship or our security concerns." The public conversation had also evolved significantly in the months since the revelations. Initial shock and outrage had given way to more nuanced discussions about institutional reform and accountability. Parliamentary committees had been established to examine the palace's operations, while Commonwealth countries had accelerated their movements toward Republican government. Most importantly, the revelations had inspired broader conversations about how powerful institutions treat whistleblowers and truth-tellers. Harry's decision to expose the systematic campaign against him had emboldened others to speak out about their own experiences with institutional abuse. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had left her position as a senior civil servant to become an advocate for institutional reform, reached out to Harry during this period. "Your courage in releasing those documents has created space for the rest of us to tell our stories," she told him during a video call. "Government departments, corporations, universities, they all use similar tactics to silence people who challenge their operations. Your revelations have given us a roadmap for documenting and exposing these practices." The conversation with Dr. Martinez helped Harry understand that his personal story had become part of something much larger. The documents he had released weren't just evidence of royal family dysfunction, they were a case study in how institutional power operates and protects itself. This realization influenced Harry's decision about how to respond to his father's outreach. Rather than focusing solely on personal reconciliation, he began to see an opportunity to use his unique position to advocate for systematic change. Harry's response to Charles came in the form of a carefully crafted letter that outlined conditions for any future relationship.
The letter, which Harry also released publicly, established clear boundaries while leaving room for gradual rebuilding of trust.
I appreciate your acknowledgement of the harm that was done, Harry wrote. However, accountability requires more than private apologies. If you are genuinely committed to change, I would ask you to consider the following actions. First, establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to examine the palace's treatment of family members over the past 3 decades. Second, create a substantial fund to support organizations working to combat institutional racism and abuse. Third, use your platform to advocate for transparency and accountability in all British institutions, not just the monarchy. The letter concluded with a personal note: I will always love you as my father, but I can only have a relationship with you if that relationship is built on truth and justice rather than convenience and tradition. My children deserve to know their grandfather, but only if he is committed to creating a world where their mixed-race heritage is celebrated rather than seen as a liability.
Charles's response surprised everyone, including Harry.
Instead of negotiating privately or issuing a defensive statement, the king announced that he would implement all of Harry's suggestions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be established with independent oversight, the fund would be created with initial capital of £100 million, and Charles committed to using his constitutional role to advocate for transparency across British institutions.
The announcement sent shockwaves through the establishment.
Conservative politicians accused Charles of caving to blackmail and destroying centuries of tradition. But progressive voices praised the move as evidence that institutional change was possible, even in the most traditional organizations. For Harry, his father's response represented something he had never dared to hope for: genuine accountability that led to systematic change.
The personal reconciliation would take time. Trust, once broken so completely, could only be rebuilt gradually.
But the institutional changes suggested that his revelations had achieved their broader purpose.
The impact on his relationship with William was more complex.
His brother had remained largely silent after his initial statement, focusing instead on his royal duties and young family. But, through intermediaries, William had indicated that he was open to private conversations about healing their relationship. Unlike with Charles, however, William had not acknowledged his role in the campaign against Harry and Meghan, making reconciliation more difficult. A year after the first documents were released, Harry and Meghan made their first joint public appearance since the revelations began. They attended the launch of the Archewell Foundation's new initiative supporting whistleblowers and institutional reform advocates. The event, held at UCLA, brought together activists, scholars, and survivors of institutional abuse from around the world. During his speech at the event, Harry reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, I made the difficult decision to expose systematic abuse within my own family and institution. I did it because I believed that truth was more important than protecting powerful people who had chosen cruelty over accountability. Today, I'm proud to say that decision has created space for others to tell their stories and demand change from the institutions that have failed them. The audience included several people whose lives had been changed by Harry's revelations. There was the civil servant who had successfully challenged discriminatory practices in her department, the university student who had exposed hazing and abuse in her fraternity system, and the corporate employee who had documented systematic harassment and won significant reforms at her company. As Harry looked out at the crowd, he saw the faces of people who had found courage in his story to confront their own institutional abusers. The personal cost of his revelations had been enormous: relationships destroyed, family bonds severed, a lifetime of emotional baggage to process and heal. But, seeing the broader impact of his decision, Harry felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him throughout his years as a working royal. Meghan, in her own speech, addressed the specific impact on families and children. When we decided to speak truth to power, we knew our own children would grow up with complicated questions about their heritage and their family. But we also knew that silence would teach them that powerful people deserve protection more than vulnerable people deserve justice. Today, Archie and Lilibet are growing up in a world where their parents chose truth over comfort, and where institutions are being held accountable for the harm they cause. The event concluded with the announcement of a new international network of organizations supporting institutional whistleblowers and reform advocates. The network, funded partly by the foundation Charles had established in response to Harry's conditions, would provide legal support, mental health resources, and advocacy training for people challenging powerful institutions. As Harry and Meghan returned to their home that evening, they found a package waiting for them. Inside was a handwritten letter from a 12-year-old girl in Manchester whose teacher had shown her class a documentary about institutional courage inspired by Harry's story. Dear Prince Harry, the letter began, I wanted to thank you for showing me that telling the truth is more important than making powerful people comfortable. My classmates were bullying a girl because of her religion, and some teachers were ignoring it. I remembered your story and decided to document what was happening and report it to the headmaster. It was scary, but it worked. The bullying stopped, and the school changed their policies. I'm proud that I chose to be brave like you. Reading the letter, Harry felt tears in his eyes. This was why he had released the documents. Not for revenge against his family, not for public vindication, but for moments like this, when a 12-year-old girl found the courage to stand up against injustice because she had learned that truth-telling, however difficult, was a form of love. That night, as Harry tucked his own children into bed, Archie asked him a question that had become increasingly common. Daddy, why don't we see Grandpa Charles and Uncle William very much? Harry had prepared for this moment, consulting with child psychologists about how to explain complex family dynamics and institutional conflict in age-appropriate ways. Well, buddy, Harry said gently, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt other people. When that happens, the person who got hurt has to decide whether to pretend everything is okay or to tell the truth about what happened. I chose to tell the truth, even though it meant some relationships in our family got complicated. Are you sad about it? Archie asked with the directness that only children possess. Harry considered the question honestly. Sometimes I am sad, he admitted. I love my family, and it's hard when relationships are difficult. But I'm also proud that I chose to tell the truth, because that's what I want to teach you and your sister, that truth and justice are more important than keeping powerful people comfortable. Archie nodded with the serious expression he wore when processing important information. I think you made the right choice, Daddy. Later that evening, Harry stood in his garden looking up at the stars, reflecting on the extraordinary year that had passed. The scared little boy who had once walked behind his mother's coffin had grown into a man capable of challenging the most powerful institution in Britain. The process had been painful and costly, but it had also been necessary. The documents he had released would forever change how people understood the monarchy and institutional power. More importantly, they had created a template for how individuals could challenge systematic abuse and demand accountability from powerful organizations. As he walked back toward the house where his wife and children slept peacefully, Harry felt something he had rarely experienced during his years as a working royal: genuine peace. He had chosen truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and the future over the past. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as a man who had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable the cruelty of those you love.